Welcome to this program by Radboud Reflects, the Green Office of Radboud University and Noordboek Uitgeverij. Tonight we're going to speak to Melanie Joy, best-selling author, psychologist, public speaker, and author of a book, this book actually, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs and Wear Cows. We speak to her because of on the occasion of the Dutch translation of this book, which is, I think, the 19th translation, but Melanie can correct me if I'm wrong. Melanie, we're so glad to have you. We would have liked to have you in person, but Corona again interrupted. But thanks to technology, we are able to speak to each other more or less in person. So that's great. Great to have you.
Thank you. It's really good to be here, and thank you for being so accommodating.
Thank you. So the first question, I think the obvious question is, why did you write this book?
Yeah, well, the book emerged out of my own personal experience and then out of my research, and I'll start with my personal experience. It actually emerged out of my childhood experience. When I was young, when I was a child, I had a dog who I grew up with, who I loved like a family member. And I also grew up eating meat and eggs and dairy. And I was also, of course, a person who cared about animals and would never want to contribute to their suffering. But over the course of so many years and so many meals, I just never thought about how strange it was that I could pet my dog with one hand while I ate like a pork chop with the other, a pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as sentient and conscious and intelligent as my dog. I just didn't connect the dots at the time. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until 1989, when I was 23 years old, that I stopped eating animals. What happened was I ate a hamburger that had been contaminated with a bacteria, and I ended up in the hospital on intravenous antibiotics. I was really, really sick. And so after that experience, I just couldn't eat meat again. And it wasn't because of any conscious ethical decision. I was just disgusted by meat. And so in the course of learning how to cook for myself, my new diet was vegetarian at the time, I, not surprisingly perhaps, stumbled upon information about animal agriculture. And what I learned shocked and horrified me. I could not believe the extent of the suffering and the harm that was being inflicted on non-human animals, and also on the environment, and frankly on my own body as a consumer of these products. I quickly became vegan. I ended up meeting a vegan, and I became vegan shortly thereafter. But I was just shocked and horrified. But what shocked me in some ways even more than what I was learning was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. They would say things like, "Don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal." Or they'd call me a crazy vegan hippie propagandist. And these were my friends and my family. They were rational people. They were compassionate people. They loved our dog. They were justice-minded. They were people just like I had been throughout my life when I was eating animals. And so I became very curious as to how rational, caring people could just stop thinking and feeling when it came to the issue of eating animals. And this ultimately led me to my doctoral studies on the psychology of violence and nonviolence broadly, and then my thesis, my doctoral thesis, which I wrote on the psychology of eating animals. And that was what led me to identify what I came to call carnism, which we'll talk about, and to write my book, which is about carnism.
Okay, thank you. One of the keys in the explanation of exactly the question you asked, the strange dichotomy of petting animals on the one hand and eating animals and supporting a system of cruelty on the other hand. One of the key concepts you discuss in unraveling this is the concept of schema. So we live with certain schemes, certain schemas in our head. Could you explain that a little bit more, what you mean by that?
Sure. A schema is basically just a mental framework, right? We have schemas are what our minds create in order to give us shortcuts as a way to manage all of the massive amounts of information that we are exposed to every day. So, for example, when you hear the word nurse, chances are somebody immediately comes to mind, probably a woman, even though many nurses aren't women today, but probably a woman who's dressed in a certain uniform, who's in a hospital setting. You don't have to sit and think about that word nurse and figure out what exactly that means. Your mind has already created a framework or a mental image, essentially, of what this word refers to. And so we have schemas when it comes to eating animals. We have animals, we've placed animals in categories in our minds, right? So we think of some animals as edible, some animals as inedible. These are two different schemas that we have, a schema for edible animals and a schema for inedible animals. And people don't even need to worry about this concept of a schema. Really, what's most important to be aware of is that we learn what carnism does, and I'll talk about more about carnism, but what this system of carnism does is it conditions us to relate to those animals that we have learned to classify as edible in a very different way than we would relate to other animals if we didn't have a schema of edible around them. Carnism, the definition I use for carnism is that it's the invisible belief system or ideology, I'm using these words interchangeably, that conditions us to eat certain animals. Carnism is essentially the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system. But the only reason that we might eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity, which is true for many people, not everybody, but many people in the world today, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. But when the belief system itself is invisible, we don't even realize that when we eat animals, we're acting in accordance with the tenets or the teachings of a belief system. We learn to think of eating animals as just a given, just the way things are.
I would like to come back to carnism and the ideology of it shortly, but I want to ask a follow-up question on these schemas. To what extent are these schemas culturally dependent? Because in the book you mentioned an example of a dinner where you supposedly reveal to people you've just been eating a golden retriever, and people go like, "Oh, wow!"
Right.
But people wouldn't do that in Korea or China, where they actually eat dogs. So they have a different schema there. So to what extent are these schemas inherent to us humans, and to what extent are they culturally transmitted?
Yeah, it's a great question. In meat-eating cultures around the world, people learn to classify a small handful of animals as edible, and all the rest we learn to classify as inedible and often disgusting and even offensive to consume. And so even though the type of species consumed changes from culture to culture, members of all cultures tend to find their own choices to be rational, and the choices of other cultures to be irrational and often disgusting and, as I said, even offensive. And you used Korea as an example. It's true that some people in Korea, and I was in South Korea for the release of my book there, Why We Love Dogs, in South Korea, and it was in Korean. It was the first foreign language publication, actually, of Why We Love Dogs. And I went there to give talks on carnism. And it's true that some people in Korea eat dogs, but not all people. In fact, many people don't. Nevertheless, they don't eat all kinds of dogs. They would not eat golden retrievers. They would not eat Maltese. The dogs that they learn to think of as pets who they live with, and there are many, many people in South Korea actually have dogs as pets. They would never think of eating these particular breeds. So these schemas, this way that we compartmentalize applies not just to species, but also beyond species.
Okay, so now let's go to carnism. Why this term, and why is it so important to label it and to make it visible by
Well,
labeling?
yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And one of the reasons that I wrote my book was to raise awareness. I didn't want to write just another book about why people shouldn't eat animals. We have a lot of information about the problems, the consequences of animal agriculture. I wanted to write a book about why people do eat animals in the first place. My question was, how is it possible for people like myself, as I said, like my friends and family, to support what can only be called a global atrocity? An atrocity is a mass traumatic event. How is it that good people can enable such harmful practices without even realizing what they're doing? And so the purpose of this book is to raise awareness, because when people become aware, and naming carnism is a big part of raising awareness, if we don't name it, we can't often see it. If we can't see it, we can't question it, we can't challenge it. People just like myself, when I was growing up, nobody ever asked me if I believed in eating animals, if how I felt about eating animals. It was just a given. It was just the way things are. There was no name. There was no belief system that was identified. I was just following what everybody else was doing. So I really wanted to make the invisible visible so that people would recognize that they do have a choice and that they are making a choice when they eat animals. And this, gives people the opportunity to make their food choices more freely, because without awareness, there is no free choice. Mm-hmm. And when you become aware of the way, not just of what carnism is, that it's this, system, but also of how the system operates and the specific ways that the system influences your thought processes and shapes your very preferences and feelings and drives your behaviors. When you become aware of these aspects of carnism, it gives you the opportunity to separate yourself from carnism and to make food choices that reflect what you authentically think and feel rather than what you've been taught to think and feel.
Mm-hmm. This ties into the next question. You talked about raising awareness, and you talked about why you wrote the book. Could you also talk a little bit about for whom this book is meant? Who is your reader, ideally speaking? Is it people that are already converted, so to speak, to the other side, to vegetarianism, veganism, or is it to entrenched meat eaters, or who are you talking to in the book?
I wrote this book originally my intention was to write this book for people who were not vegan or vegetarian, but who I knew were people who had, shared, most of us do share the core moral values of caring or compassion and fairness, of justice. People who care about their impact on other animals, on the environment, and on themselves. And people who were nevertheless making food choices that were acting against these core values and against the interests of other animals and the environment, and ultimately also themselves. So it was originally for people who are still steeped in this ideology of carnism to help them to see the system more clearly. Because one of the things that carnism does, one of the ways that it maintains itself, is that it conditions us to resist any information that would actually free us from the carnistic box in the first place. So many people who would naturally recognize, whose values are naturally in alignment with vegan values, right? With non-carnistic values, we could say, nevertheless, sometimes feel defensive against information that would help them act on these values because they've been so conditioned to resist information that challenges carnism. So by illuminating the defenses of carnism, it helps people to be less defensive and more open. And I also, a secondary reason that I had written my book was for people who are already vegan and who struggled to understand the mentality of the people that they've been reaching out to and trying to raise awareness to. So many vegan advocates, they care so deeply about the issue. They feel the way that, most people who are not vegans would feel if they woke up one day and discovered that all of the meat and eggs or meat and dairy in the world came from slaughtered puppies and kittens and dogs and cats. They would be on the streets in moral outrage. But these same people support carnism, right? So many vegan advocates have become deeply frustrated because they can't understand the resistance they're encountering. And so this book was also to help them understand the psychology of the people who are maybe resisting their message so that they could advocate more effectively and also recognize that good people can participate in harmful practices, and that doesn't make them bad people. The problem is not the individual, it's the system.
You talked about compassion. In the book, indeed, you have several chapters on it. Maybe it's a good idea now to go to these defense mechanisms that you talk about, because people are compassionate. They are compassionate about other people. They're compassionate about their dogs. They're not compassionate about the pigs on their plate. What kind of mechanisms are at play there? Why is our compassion restricted to certain animals in this scheme of edible and non-edible animals? And why don't we direct our compassion to the pigs and the chicken that we eat?
Well, carnism is it's a special kind of belief system. It's a dominant system. And what that means is that it is so widespread that its tenets, its teachings are basically, they're invisible. They're woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. They become institutionalized, right? So when we study nutrition, we're typically studying carnistic nutrition. Carnism is not only a dominant system, but it's also a violent system. It's an oppressive system. The whole system is organized around violence. It's organized around turning beings into things. And meat cannot be procured without violence, and egg and dairy production cause extensive harm to animals. In fact, these are probably the most brutal of all carnistic industries today. And a system such as carnism, it runs counter to core human values. We know that we humans and some other animals are hardwired to feel empathy for others, and that includes other animals. Our natural instinct when we see other animals is to not want to see them to suffer. People turn away from animals suffering. And so carnism and other systems of oppression needs to use a set of psychological defense mechanisms. And what these defense mechanisms do is they distort our perceptions so that we disconnect from our natural empathy for those animals we've learned to classify as edible without fully realizing what we're doing.
Okay, one of these defense mechanisms you talk about is the idea that eating meat is natural, it's necessary, and it's normal. That could be an objection, actually, to also the vegan practices. The fact that it's natural for us to eat animal. We have done so throughout history. People could point to evolution, for instance, an evolutionary perspective in which we have been meat eaters for a very long period of time. What would you answer to such an objection?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one carnistic defense is justification. We learn to justify eating animals. And the way that we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of eating animals are the facts of eating animals. We learn to believe in what I refer to as the 3 ends of justification, as you said, that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And these same justifications, of course, have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history, such as heterosexual supremacy and male dominance. It's important to recognize that when we're born into a dominant system, such as carnism, we inevitably internalize that system. That means we learn to look at the world through the lens of carnism. And this applies as well to institutions. and to fields. So, for example, when we talk about eating animals being natural, we tend to look at history through the lens of carnism. And what we see is carnistic history. So we look back, it's absolutely true that humans have been eating animals for millennia. There's no question, we know that. But we only look as far back in history as we need to justify our current carnistic choices. Our very oldest ancestors were actually fruit eaters, whose descendants then started eating animals. Now, it's also true that humans have been murdering other humans and raping other humans for as long as we've been eating animals. And yet we don't invoke the longevity of these practices as a justification for them today.
You talked about oppression. What I could imagine is that some people might be appalled at that and would say oppression is something when people oppress other people. Talking about oppressing animals could at best be a metaphor. What would you answer to that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that question, actually. What I talked about was that carnism is I called it a system of oppression.
Yes.
So and you make a really good point. It's really important to acknowledge that, the experience of each set of victims of oppression or exploitation or violence, whatever we want to say, the experience of the victims will always be unique. People get offended when we compare the experience of victims, and that's totally understandable because nobody's experience of victimization is ever the same as somebody else's. However, from a psychological perspective, it's very important to recognize that the structure of these systems is the same. And most importantly, the mentality that enables the violence, the oppression, is the same. The same mentality that enables us to carry out violence, oppression, exploitation, harm to human individuals of whatever group enables us to carry out violence and harm toward non-human individuals. And this is where my focus is. My focus is not on comparing the experience of victims, but looking at what is the mindset that allows us to disconnect from our empathy and cause unnecessary suffering and harm to other individuals.
And so what would you say is the main reason why it's so bad to cause harm to animals? Is it because animals have rights? Is it because they can suffer? Does it have to do with the environment? What are the reasons for finding it so bad?
That's an interesting question. Probably the same reason that people would find it pretty bad to carry out harm to children or to carry out harm to older people, because people who have lives that matter to them, people would, let me back up, the same reason that most people, at least in the West, and many people in the East as well, would find it inappropriate and quote unquote bad to cause harm to dogs and to cause harm to cats. There's the difference between those species we've learned to classify as edible and the species we learn to love as our family members and our friends is there's less a difference between these species than there is in our perception of the species.
Okay. In the book, you talk about these practices of oppression, and you also run a few statistics. So I've read the 2020 updated version, and the number you invoke is a staggering 11 billion animals being slaughtered each year in the US alone. I don't have the numbers for this country, but it's probably as bad as the United States here. How was it to write those passages? Because you write about the practices in the slaughterhouses, in these CAFOs, confined animal food. What is it? The O stands for?
Operations.
Operations. So actually, factory farms. So these are grueling statistics. It's a really bleak picture of what the meat industry actually does. How was it to write it? Because reading it gave me the shivers. I have to say. How was it writing that stuff?
Yeah, well, it gave you the shivers because you have empathy, and it's hard when you have empathy to bear witness to the suffering of others, whether they're human or non-human, causes you to feel suffering to some degree yourself as well, which is what what we were just talking about a minute ago. Why do people feel like this is not a good thing to do? We don't even have to analyze that rationally. We see someone suffering and we know they're in pain, and we don't want to cause others unnecessary harm and pain. So it was difficult for me to write that. It was very difficult for me to write that. And it's difficult for anybody who does feel empathy, and most people do have a high enough degree of empathy to feel pain themselves when they're confronted with animal suffering. And this is this is our gift. Our empathy is our gift. Our empathy is what gives me hope for the future of our world. And our empathy is also sometimes a problem because we turn away because it hurts us. When it's painful for us to see somebody else suffering, it's easier sometimes to turn away from that. And carnistic industry knows this and gives us the tools to make it easier for us to not pay attention, to not ask. It's a don't ask, don't tell system.
Could you give some examples of that, of this kind of strategy?
Well, you look at advertisements for meat, eggs, and dairy, for example. We have advertisements we have these absurd advertisements, for example, of pigs dancing over the barbecue fire pit in which their body is meant to be roasted, holding a fork and a knife, laughing at you, beseeching the viewer, asking the viewer to come buy this product, which is their dead body parts. It's absolute absurdity, and we don't recognize it as absurd because we're so steeped in carnism. And it is also a distancing mechanism. It's a way of making light of something that is actually a tragedy. It is a global tragedy. When we look at carnistic advertising, it is advertising that is largely designed to assuage, to soothe the conscience of the consumer. The meat and eggs and dairy that make it to our plates, they bear little to no resemblance of the individuals that they once were. They come neatly packaged, sanitized, often in the past, people used to like, more quote unquote red meats, but people are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of seeing anything reminiscent of an animal. Something like blood is now a turnoff.
Mm-hmm. You talked about hope. Your book ends on a hopeful note. You place a lot of trust into our mechanisms of empathy and compassion. Is that realistic?
I don't think our individuals with empathy and compassion are going to be the only solution to changing the world. We have to obviously motivate institutions to change, and we have to obviously use other forms of motivation as well. This is why a lot of advocacy is focused on, vegan advocacy, for example, is focused on getting companies to, recognize that they don't have to lose profits when they stop producing animals. They can actually produce products that don't require slaughtering animals and still make money off of those. This is why we have clean meats, for example. So I'm not naive enough to think that that empathy is going to resolve this problem or all of our problems. Mm-hmm. However, the fact that we do have empathy is motivating to enough people to take action enough to hopefully work for political reform and all kinds of other reforms.
I was wondering in the book, one of the steps I would say towards a non-meat-free world is the production of humane meat. humane methods of animal holding, biological, organic meat. In the book, you're very harsh about that. There are a few passages in which you speak about it, and you maintain that this is actually supporting the system of carnism. It's not something that is leading out of the system. Could you dwell a little bit on that? Why are you being so harsh on that issue?
I wouldn't classify my characterization as harsh. I do believe, there are some advocacy groups that are doing great work, working to using reforms as a means toward, limiting the amount of animals who are being produced, for example. At the same time, what I point out in my book is that this idea of humane meat, it's a contradiction in terms. And the way to recognize the contradiction in these terms is to, again, step out of the carnistic box, right? So most people would consider it cruel to slaughter a happy, healthy golden retriever just because somebody likes the way her legs taste. And yet, when the exact same thing is done to members of other species, carnistic industry wants us to call that humane. It only seems humane when we think of it when we are looking at this through the lens of carnism. This is simply another form of carnism. Now, I also recognize that, that many people, I believe most people probably, who have decided that they want to eat animal products that come from animals who were not raised in factory farms, for example, are doing so because they care and they're trying to do less harm. I would encourage people, nevertheless, to try to reduce the amount of carnistic products they're eating rather than simply change the type of carnistic products they're consuming. And I do believe that eventually, when we have stepped out of this mindset, we will see the kind of bizarreness of this concept of humanely slaughtered individuals.
Okay, but nevertheless, I would think that when I'm in the supermarket, and I have as an alternative, suppose I am a meat eater, I have the alternative between the regular meat produced by the meat industry, that the practices of which you describe, and this humane meat. I choose this humane meat, then I let my compassion speak a little bit louder, so to speak. So this could be a step on the way to ending the awful practices that you speak of, despite the fact that indeed humane meat, philosophically speaking, is a contradiction in terms. But it is different. It's a different set of practices. In any case, you don't have these factory farms in this system, in the system of humane meat. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. First of all, I do agree with you that and as I said, that people who want to make this choice are doing so from a place of concern, and that's a good thing. Like I'm grateful that enough people have become concerned enough that carnistic industry had to try to create something that seems better. And, but a couple of things to that. One is that it's not that there are only two choices for consumers, either factory farmed meat or humane meat. There's lots and lots of other alternatives. And there are plant-based alternatives that are pretty much almost identical to meat now. So we're living in a time where we're not really trapped between two options and we have to choose the lesser of evils. Mm-hmm. To your point, however, where you talk about, well, isn't this doing less harm? It depends, right? Because when it comes to if you were to choose between two types of animal products, it really depends, because many of the so-called farms in which animals are treated more humanely nevertheless suffer quite significantly. And often, certainly in the United States, and I'm not sure if it's the same in the Netherlands, but animals they're all sent to the same slaughterhouses. Yeah. Yeah. But I think, really what I encourage people to do is to, learn about it. If you're curious, if you really do want to do less harm, there are so many alternatives, and perhaps you will land in your mind and say, okay, these meats are the best I can do right now in my life. But learn about it, get informed, find out where those animals are coming from, and ask yourself, how plant-based can I make my lifestyle? And I always encourage people to really not think that you have to, that either you're vegan and you're part of the solution, or you're not vegan and you're part of the problem. That's, I think, a problematic way of thinking. I always encourage people to, really try to just see carnism and veganism on a spectrum. Where you are on that spectrum is in some ways more important, where you're heading on that spectrum is in some ways more important than where you are. And so just ask yourself at each meal, how can I be as vegan as possible? And, my friend Kathy Freston, another writer, says, think of it as crowding out rather than cutting out foods. Add more plant-based foods to your meals, and then you'll have less room for animal-based foods.
Okay. I want to come back to these to the three N's because it started up with this question. We talked about eating meat as being natural, but another defense strategy is to say that eating meat is necessary. We need the proteins. Could you tell a little bit more about that strategy, about that point?
I really believe that the N of necessity is the foundation, the strongest N that keeps the system alive. Okay. And if you look at violent, systems, look at atrocities and violent systems throughout history, you can see that the populace supported the violence in large part because they were convinced that doing so was necessary for the survival of the race or of the nation, for example. In this case, we're talking about of the species. And when this N of necessity becomes destabilized, the system starts to destabilize. When a behavior is no longer recognized as a necessity, then it becomes recognized as a choice. And it takes on an ethical dimension it didn't have in the same way before. And I believe that that's what's happening now with the destabilization of carnism. More and more people are realizing that it's not necessary to eat animals to survive, and certainly not to be healthy. In fact, what we're learning from the tremendous body of medical and nutritional literature now, and from climate scientists, is that it's necessary to stop eating animals, or at least to eat a lot less carnistic products if we want to be healthy and if we want to have a planet to leave to our grandchildren. Now, for some people, it is a necessity to eat animals because, you need to have enough, you need to be able to make your food choices freely in order to, you need to be economically advantaged enough to make your food choices freely. And people who are not economically advantaged really don't have a choice as to what they eat. And carnistic products are heavily subsidized and often a lot cheaper than some of the plant-based products.
Yeah, that was another question I had. It's also about the audience of your book. We talked about earlier who is supposed to read this book, but it is someone who is actually able to buy non-meat products and plant-based products. And I don't know about the United States, but in this country that is indeed more expensive because meat is subsidized by the European Union so much. So don't you, isn't this in that sense still an elitist issue, an elitist problem also?
Well, I mean, first of all, the problem is not necessarily having access to plant-based versus carnistic foods. It's having access to healthy foods, period. Yeah. So this is how, problems like racism and patriarchy intersect with problems like carnism. The vegan movement has often, and veganism has often been portrayed as elitist, as catering to people who are economically, in a position to spend a lot of money on their food. And as I said, I am not speaking to people who can't make their food choices freely. However, at the same time, it's important to recognize that the movement itself is more diverse than meets the eye. The vegan movement, it's a movement, and that means it's a microcosm of the broader culture. And just like the broader culture, it's much more diverse than it appears, because people in positions of leadership tend to be people who are white, tend to be people who are male, actually, and tend to not represent the actual body and diversity of the movement. So vegans of color, for example, have spoken out about the fact that we look like a white movement, but we're less of a white movement than we might, than it might seem. So I think, you ask a very important question, and these are questions that we need to continue to grapple with. I think it's very important when we're messaging around food choice to be mindful of the fact that not everybody can make their food choices freely, as I've said, and at the same time to not just focus on the expensive vegan meat replacements. Those are expensive, but some of the people in the world who have who eat the simplest are already eating vegan foods. They're eating beans and rice and vegetables, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there are alternatives.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's time to turn to the audience. Let's see whether there are questions. I have to open this up. I don't see any questions yet. So I asked the audience to, you can ask your questions through Mentimeter. I think the code was projected, so you can ask your questions through entering the code, and then Melanie can answer your questions. Talking about all of this, I am a philosopher. I'm going to ask a little bit of a philosophical question. There seems to be a strange dynamics in this whole carnistic system of visibility versus invisibility. So on the one hand, the system wants to make itself invisible. We don't want the public to see these factory farms. We don't want to see what's going on in the slaughterhouses. On the other hand, there's the promotion of meat, saying that it's necessary, etc. That seems to be a bit of a conflicting dynamics between visibility and invisibility. What do you think about that?
I mean, what's visible is the end product. What's invisible is how individuals are turned into that product. And so the focus is on the product itself, which reinforces this idea that animals are products in the first place.
Okay. In the meantime, we have questions. You don't mention fish and seafood. Is that on purpose?
In my book, I certainly do mention fish and seafood. Yeah. Absolutely. It might be a language issue also, because when I talk about fish, fish is a form of meat.
Yeah, but if you talk about the system of cruelty and so on, does that include actually the fishing practices in your view?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have a section in my book describing the cruel practice. And in fact, of how fish and other aquatic animals are turned into meat for consumption, for human consumption. Yeah, and in fact, for people who want to start reducing, or being as vegan as possible, one of the most impactful things you can do is actually to reduce your consumption of fish and of chickens, because in terms of the number of individuals consumed by an individual consumer, it's much higher when you're talking about the smaller animals. So one person consumes many more fish in a given year than they would cows, for example, because cows are much larger.
Next question. I I think this is an interesting question, and certainly for a psychologist. How do you start talking about veganism to carnistic friends and family? I think this is a real problem. Could you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenge. And we have at carnism.org, my organization Beyond Carnism runs the Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy. And we have courses and we have trainings, we have webinars, we have books, all sorts of materials that address this very issue, which is a great issue. And one of the reasons it is challenging is because carnism becomes internalized and the defenses become internalized. So vegans who are trying to raise awareness can find that as soon as they open their mouth and say, I'm vegan, they're hit with this wall of defenses. And so one of the things that I would recommend to everybody, vegan or not, is to learn the principles of effective communication. Because, underneath this difference between veganism and carnism is a relationship between people. And that's where our focus needs to be. My newer work actually focuses on building relational literacy. Relational literacy is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And this is really fundamental. If we hope to help create a better world for everybody, all of us need to learn to not only communicate effectively, but to learn how to relate in a way that is healthy so that our movements become healthy, our communication becomes more effective, and the change we're working toward is also healthier. So I would say I actually have my book, Getting Relationships Right, is a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. And we have a lot of free resources as well on our website. But I would say get informed and learn about the psychology of carnism so you understand the defenses. So when these defenses come up, you can see them for what they are. Very often vegans get stuck in this battle of defenses. But what about the animals? But what about this? But what about that? And it turns into a debate rather than a conversation. And if you're talking to people in your life that are somewhat close to you, one thing that you can do that I always actually recommend that you try to do is to ask them not to become vegan, because people need to be ready to become vegan, but to invite them to become an ally to you, of what I call a vegan ally, somebody who's not fully vegan themselves, but they're a supporter of veganism and of the vegans in their lives. If you are close to another person, you can't have true closeness and connection unless you understand each other's inner world. And if you're vegan, being vegan is probably very fundamental and important to you in your life. And you can say to the people in your life, listen, I'd love to share information with you about veganism, not to turn you vegan, but so you understand me. So you understand what the world looks like through my eyes and why I feel the way that I do. Mm-hmm. And often vegans find that when the people in their lives really see them, they don't feel invisible anymore and understand them and respect them. When they respect you for who you are and what you've chosen, that can transform your relationship.
And that can actually lower this wall, the defense wall you're talking about, because I think this is a common experience for vegetarians and vegans, that people in their direct milieu environment react so strongly. They are appalled. They are they feel even humiliated by your food choice, which is, rationally speaking, a bit ridiculous. But this is how it goes. Would that indeed lower this wall that comes toward you if you talk about your food choices being different from carnism?
Well, it really depends, right? When you know how to communicate and relate in a way that's effective, you can create an environment where defenses become lowered. And you learn how to do that. And it's not just about veganism, carnism, it's everything. All of us need to learn how to do this. Mm-hmm. Because whatever you're talking about, whenever you have a difference of opinion, and particularly when that difference of opinion is around a moral issue, where there's a lot of emotion and a lot of moral investment, knowing how to communicate effectively certainly lowers defenses, because the goal of the communication, let me back up. I always say that with friends and family, this is not a real an appropriate forum for advocacy. It's a good idea not to advocate to the people in your life. However, if you want the people in your life to be open to learning about veganism, don't have as your goal to change them. Have as your goal to help them understand the issue simply so that they can understand you, so that you can be more connected with each other. And they will automatically probably become less defensive because you're inviting them into understanding without causing them to feel like you're trying to force them to change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so this is a related question from the audience. How can I introduce veganism to carnists without stepping on toes or lecture them or attack them on their choices? That's all. You already spoke a little bit about that, but could you say something more about that?
I can. One thing I'll say is that in the original edition of my book, I used the word carnist, and in the new edition, I've taken it out. So I advocate saying non-vegan rather than carnist. And I did that because I discovered that some vegans were using that as a slur and, negatively. And I also realized that it's not fair to create a label for somebody when they're unintentionally, living a certain lifestyle. So I would recommend saying non-vegan rather than carnist. This is a tricky situation when you're a vegan and you're trying to communicate with non-vegans in a way that doesn't cause them to feel offended or feel controlled. And one of the reasons it's tricky is because there are a lot of negative vegan stereotypes that are alive and well, and these stereotypes, like many negative stereotypes about people who are working toward social change, such as feminists, these stereotypes often exist as a way of silencing you and your message. It's a form of shoot the messenger. If you shoot the messenger, you don't have to take seriously the implications of their message. And one stereotype is vegans are trying to take away my freedom of choice and control me. And, this is also, it's a relational issue. In a relationship between people where there's a power differential, when one person has more social power than the other, often, not always, but often, and you can see this, for example, in heterosexual relationships, when a woman might be challenging a man's choices, often the person with more power feels easily controlled. So it's a very tricky situation. So one thing I would say to you is, again, learn about the psychology of carnism, not just about how it affects non-vegans, but how it affects vegans, because vegans internalize these messages too. Many vegans feel ashamed of asking to have their needs met because they believe that means that they're controlling or they're picky eaters or they're just demanding or it's never good enough for me as a vegan. Try to, if you can approach the situation and just make it about you and your story, not use the word you, but use the word me, and share your story and your experience and then make a request, that will increase the chances that your message will be heard the way you intend it to be. So, for example, you might say, I would really appreciate it if we could, when we go out to a restaurant, if we could go to a restaurant that's really vegan friendly so I can have food to choose from as well. And the reason this is so important for me is because, I so often feel alone in restaurants or, just share your experience, what it's like for you, and let them know what you need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a great answer. Yeah, this is a nice question. Are you worried at all that the word carnism can lead to aggressive or defensive responses from carnists? You already briefly touched upon that.
I find that I think that's a really good question. The word carnist I would not use, and I don't think the word carnist is respectful. However, the word carnism and the adjective carnistic I think are very important to use. And what I have found is that they actually reduce defensiveness, because when we talk about carnism, we place the focus on the system rather than the individual. We say the problem is carnism. You were born into carnism. I was born into carnism. And I think we need to use this word because I very much believe that it is impossible to have a truly objective conversation about the issue of eating animals as long as we are communicating from within the very system, the mentality of the system that conditions us to think that it's legitimate and appropriate to eat animals. It's like, how could women talk about, the abuse of women, or domestic violence, for example, in the 1950s or whenever, I don't know when patriarchy was named, I don't remember, but before patriarchy was named. When you name a system, you make it something that's not about individuals as much as it is about how those individuals have been conditioned by a system. Mm-hmm. And I also advocate I try to use carnistic rather than animal when I'm saying products, for example, or industry to stop. I want to disconnect this link between animals and products in people's minds. And I prefer to say carnistic products, carnistic industry, carnistic agriculture.
Okay. This is already answered. This is a question you might find difficult to answer. Do you see any differences between the USA and the Netherlands concerning carnism and vegetarianism and veganism? Have you any idea?
I can say differences in Europe. I mean, and there are differences like within Europe as well, individual differences. The Netherlands is quite progressive when it comes to these issues. As a matter of fact, some of the EU has more progressive laws when it comes to animal protection, or certainly some degree of farmed animal protection. I don't want to make it sound like anything is remotely fine here, because animals are suffering here tremendously. But the U.S. has fewer laws, or less legislation protecting farmed animals. That's for sure. The Netherlands also is, I believe, the leading, if not one of the leading, but I think the leading country for clean meat initiatives. Lab-grown meat as well. And one key difference in Europe in general and in the United States is that the United States has sort of a parallel movement. There's the vegan movement, and this push for veganism. There's the plant-based movement, it's almost like its own movement. There's many people in the United States become vegan for health reasons, personal health reasons. There is much more, I think, awareness of the benefits of plant-based eating in the United States than there is in Europe. There are fairly active, powerful nutritional and medical groups in the U.S. that are lobbying for change to the Food and Drug Administration dietary guidelines, for example, and have done so to some degree successfully, and really raised awareness among medical practitioners and nutritional practitioners about the benefits of a plant-based diet and the dangers of a carnistic diet.
Mm-hmm. And what is your how you wrote the book 10 years ago? There's an updated version now. There's a Dutch translation now that we spoke about. What about, let's say, in 10 years? How does the world look like then in terms of carnism and veganism and so on? What is your expectation?
It's a very good question. As people become increasingly aware of the problems inherent in carnism, and they are. We know that animal agriculture, carnistic agriculture, is, a driver of pandemics. It's a leading cause of animal exploitation, climate change now, public health problems. As awareness of the consequences of carnistic agriculture and consumption grows, more and more people are saying no to carnism and moving towards veganism, at least. And I've traveled, quite extensively talking about this issue over the past decade. I've been to 50 or so countries on 6 continents, and I have seen everywhere I've seen the same thing, which is support for veganism is growing tremendously. And so, and particularly because this N of necessity, I believe, is really becoming destabilized. It's not only that people don't feel it's necessary to eat animals for protein, for example, like they used to, but it's also easier and easier for many people anyway to be eating vegan foods. So I expect that this trend or this trajectory is going to continue to go in the same direction it has been. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we have some fairly serious problems facing our world. Carnism is one of a number of fairly serious problems we have facing our world. We're in a climate catastrophe as we speak. We've got political polarization and increasing, inequity and inequality among human groups. So whether we can turn it around or not in 10 years, I don't know, or start to, I don't know.
Okay. So you don't really want to answer the question.
No, I mean, that is my answer to the question. I don't have, because if I were to project a definitive answer to, I can't see into the future. I can say that psychologically, I can share what I've observed without making a projection about the future because I know my limitations. Mm-hmm. And what I've observed is that support for veganism is growing tremendously. And we have a lot of serious problems that we're grappling with in our world, and there's a lot that can happen between now and 10 years that affects this trajectory that I've been witnessing.
Do you think that the movement towards, let's say, ending carnism might actually not come from animal rights, animal suffering and that kind of stuff, but actually from, as you mentioned, the climate crisis? Wouldn't that be the driver in the coming 10 years of a movement towards non-carnistic alternatives?
It certainly is a driver, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger driver. And at the same time, with all of this conversation about climate change, animals remain conspicuously absent from the dialogue. And this is obviously because of carnism, right? We have some of, big groups, leading climate scientists who are still not talking about eating animals. It's just been very slow in coming. The same way we have veterinarians who are working in slaughterhouses and not challenging this issue. It's just carnism creates these, quote unquote, blind spots in people. But fortunately, the conversation is starting to really include a focus on animal agriculture. And people are motivated to support this movement, and this change for a lot of different reasons. And that's kind of the nice thing about talking about veganism in some ways. Veganism is not the solution to all the world's problems, but I believe that no solution is complete if veganism is not a part of it. My husband calls it veganism sort of a multi-problem solver, where it's addressing multiple problems at a time. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the question of the audience. Do you think that promoting the knowledge about where our meat comes from and farm practices, for example, through education, can promote eating less meat by people? Does knowledge evoke action?
Awareness certainly does. Knowledge communicated in a way that helps to raise awareness, absolutely. And we also know that behavioral change often precedes or comes before attitudinal change. So when people change their behaviors, they're more open to changing their attitudes. And this is why making it so there are more and more products available for people, so affordable, healthy products available for people that are plant-based, will also inevitably support increased support for animal rights. If it's easy to eat plant-based, if it's easy to eat vegan, and it becomes more and more normal, people will be less and less defensive against moving further towards veganism. And this is why we really need to support, sort of transitional products and make it easier for people to eat in a way that's more compassionate.
The key word here, I think, in the question was education. Is that something you're concerned with, educating the next generation about carnism and non-carnistic alternatives? Is it something you have ideas about?
I think it's important. Yeah, I think it's important to educate. Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely important to educate. There's, a movement called Humane Education, and this is a movement of educators and to train educators in how to talk about these issues, the interconnected issues of social justice, animal rights, and climate justice. The more, we can reach young people, the more likely we are to have the next generation of people who are not as defensive against veganism.
And how does such an education look like? How do we bring this about?
Well, I mean, the Institute of Humane Education, it's a great organization. It trains and certifies teachers to talk about these issues. It sends teachers into classrooms, but it also trains teachers so that they can incorporate conversations about these issues in their classrooms. And it also, humane education as a whole is not just about the content, what we are talking about, but it's also about how we teach children and young people to actually think critically. And Zoe Weil, who's the founder of the Institute for Humane Education, if anybody's interested, she's got some great TED Talks on the subject. She talks about how important it is to educate children to become solutionaries, to educate children and teach them how to think about critical social issues and to think critically so that they make choices in the future that help them to be a part of a solution to creating a better world.
On a popular news platform, people tend to say that humanizing animals is dangerous and that harming animals that are bred for eating should not be seen as doing harm. How would you answer them?
I probably would not answer them any differently than most people would answer them. I mean, if we recognizing animals' expressions of pain is not necessarily a form of anthropomorphizing. These same things were actually said about other individuals from human groups, various human groups in the past. Infants were, at one point, human infants were believed to not feel pain and were not given anesthesia when they were operated on, because there was this belief that, adults were projecting their own adult mentality onto or experience onto babies. I think we have to be very, very, careful of engaging with these kinds of dialogues that are, in complete contrast to what animal behaviorists have told us and to what most people recognize and know to be facts and the truth about other animals' experiences given their central nervous systems and so on.
We have a professor here in the Netherlands, here actually at our university, who studies the nervous system of fish, and actually has discovered that fish have the most pain receptors here, exactly where the hook goes in if you catch them. So there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of scientific evidence actually for animals to be able to suffer pain, and you referred to that in your book, don't you?
Yes.
Let's see. We get a political question. What's your stand on unorthodox vegan activism against the current bio-industry? How do we create a better world in this carnist capitalist system?
I don't really know what's meant by unorthodox vegan activism. I think that can mean a lot of different things, so I'm not sure how to interpret that so I can effectively answer the question. Is the unorthodox meaning civil disobedience, or unorthodox
Probably, yeah.
meaning...
I think so. I think so.
Yeah, I mean, it's my first book is called Strategic Action for Animals, and it is about, you know, how it addresses some of these questions, right? How can we be as effective as possible, and in what situations is it appropriate to use, for example, civil disobedience? In what situations is it more appropriate to take what might seem like a more so-called pragmatic approach? And I think, you know, I can't answer that with one blanket answer. What I do believe is that anybody who is, you know, who sees themselves as an activist or an advocate really would, it can be very, very helpful to learn about when to use what I think you're referring to as unorthodox approaches and when not to. And I'll just give you one example. You know, when a movement is really young, and it doesn't have the support of much of the populace, doing something that is illegal, particularly certain, you know, like let's talk about property destruction, for example, which is not terribly uncommon, is often used against the movement and against the activists. The activists end up becoming portrayed as violent and in opposition to the populace, when the same behavior, or the same action, I should say, that's done at the later stages of a social justice movement. So when, for example, you know, like a statue of a dictator is torn down and smashed, you know, if this is done in the later stages of a movement, then that is more likely to be celebrated and recognized as a, you know, positive revolutionary act. But when activists use the same kinds of tactics in the earlier stage of a movement, often they end up becoming framed as violent, dangerous, and in opposition to the mainstream.
Yeah. I think we have slowly we move towards the end. As I said, you wrote this book more than 10 years ago. There's an updated version from 2020, and now there's a Dutch translation, which is the 18th or 19th translation. I don't know whether you...
I'm not sure, because there are a few actually in process right now.
Yes.
I think it's the 18th.
Yes. What is what are you working on right now? What's your next project?
Well, I'm running the Center for, I'm the founding president of the organization Beyond Carnism, and our mission is to expose and transform carnism. And, you know, we do this through raising awareness of carnism and also through empowering people who are challenging carnism, and through our Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy. So we're developing a lot of new trainings for advocates and new materials for advocates, and really working on helping people who want to be communicating about this issue and about other social issues, you know, people who are already working to create a better world for all beings, to do this as effectively as possible, because there's a lot of great passion out there in the world, and most people who become advocates get less training in how to do this effectively than we would to work at a cash register. And so, you know, with the appropriate training, people can really increase their impact significantly. So we're building out our trainings and making more videos, and you know, just trying to be a support to the people doing this really important work.
Okay, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you very much for being with us, though not in, I would almost say in the flesh, but virtually. So thanks again. Thank you much. Thank you very much to the audience for watching this and for your questions. In Radboud Reflex, the Green Office, and Noordhoek Uitgeverij. Thank you very much, and see you next time, one of our activities of Radboud Reflex. Thank you very much.
Thank you.